A massive 8-1 ruling just came out of the Supreme Court, and it changes everything you thought you knew about your rights. This is a bombshell that flew under the radar for most people, but it could hit you next the very next time you step out of your house with a firearm. This is not just some distant legal talk or a boring debate between high-level lawyers in robes. This is about what happens to you during a traffic stop, a walk in the park, or a simple trip across town. The Supreme Court just handled a case called United States versus Rahimi in 2024, and the lopsided vote count of 8-1 tells a huge story. Most people are looking at the headline and thinking this case is only about one specific type of person who shouldn't have a gun. They think it doesn't apply to them because they follow the law and they are good citizens. But if you think that way, you are missing the dangerous trap that is being set for every gun owner in America right now. There is a huge amount of confusion spreading online about what this ruling actually means for the average person who carries a gun for protection. People are getting this wrong already, and that kind of mistake can lead to a prison cell or a lost right to ever own a gun again. This ruling is the first major follow-up to the famous Bruin decision, and it changes how every lower court will look at your Second Amendment rights from this day forward. In this video, I am going to explain exactly what happened in the Rahimi case, and why the media is giving you a very shallow version of the story. I will show you the hidden legal test the court just created that could be used against any ordinary American down the road. We are going to look at what the justices actually said, what they didn't say, and the big warnings that were hidden in the side opinions. You need to understand this now because the rules for carrying and owning a gun are shifting under your feet as we speak. Staying ahead of these fast legal changes is the only way to protect yourself and your family in a world where the rules change overnight. People who take their rights seriously know that being informed is just as important as having a good holster or a reliable firearm. If you want to be part of a community that gets the real legal truth without the political spin, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. We make sure you are the first to know when a major court ruling drops that affects your daily life. To understand why this 8-1 ruling is such a big deal, we have to look at how the law used to work versus how it works now. For a long time, courts used a balancing test to decide if a gun law was okay, which basically meant the government usually won if they had a good reason. But a few years ago, the Supreme Court said that was wrong and created a new rule based on history and tradition. They said if a gun law doesn't have a twin from the time of the founding, it is probably unconstitutional. The Rahimi case was the first big test of that new historical rule, and many people thought the government was going to lose this fight badly. The case involved a man who was under a civil restraining order for domestic issues, which meant a judge told him he couldn't have guns for a while. Zaki Rahimi was not a sympathetic character at all, as he was involved in several shootings, and was clearly a danger to the people around him. The government argued that they have always had the power to take guns away from people who are not law-abiding or responsible. When the decision came down, Chief Justice Roberts wrote the main opinion and explained that the government can disarm people who pose a credible threat to others. He said that even if there isn't a perfect historical twin for a modern law, there just needs to be a historical principle that matches up. This is where the simple explanation ends and the real danger for the average gun owner begins. The court basically said that as long as a law is like an old law in principle, it can stay on the books. This is a huge shift because it gives lower courts a lot of room to get creative with what they call a historical principle. It means that laws about where you can carry, how you can carry, and who can carry are all back on the table for debate in a new way. The one justice who disagreed, Justice Thomas, warned that this new approach is too blurry and could let the government chip away at our rights. He argued that the Second Amendment is not a second-class right that can be ignored just because someone seems dangerous. I want to hear from you on this because this ruling has split the gun rights community right down the middle. Do you think the court was right to focus on whether someone is a credible threat, or do you think this opens the door for too much government overreach? Some people say this is a common-sense safety measure, while others believe it is the start of a slippery slope. Drop a comment below and let me know if you think this 8-1 vote is a win for safety or a loss for our basic constitutional rights. Now that we have covered the basics of the ruling, we need to dive into the part that most people are totally missing. The big issue here is not just about restraining orders, it is about the definition of who is allowed to have a gun in the first place. For years, we have used the phrase law-abiding, responsible citizens to describe the group of people who are protected by the Second Amendment. But after this ruling, that definition is starting to feel a lot more like a trap that can be sprung on anyone at any time. The court used a very broad brush when they talked about who can be disarmed, and they didn't give a very clear list of rules for the future. This is where people get burned, because they assume that as long as they haven't committed a felony, they are perfectly safe from gun laws. But the Rahimi case was about a civil order, not a criminal conviction, which is a massive distinction that most people don't realize. You can lose your rights without ever being found guilty of a crime in a traditional jury trial. Think of it like a speed limit that isn't posted on a sign, but you are expected to know it anyway based on the flow of traffic. If the rules are not crystal clear, the person in power gets to decide if you are breaking them based on their own feelings at that moment. That is exactly what Justice Thomas was worried about when he wrote his lonely but very powerful dissent in this case. He saw that the court was moving away from hard rules and moving toward a system where judges have more power. There is a bigger hidden consequence coming up next that most people are not even talking about yet. This ruling didn't just affect one guy in Texas. It set a new blueprint for how every state can write new gun control laws. If a state wants to ban a certain type of carry or a certain type of firearm, they just have to find an old law that looks vaguely similar. We are going to look at how this will lead to a wave of new restrictions in the coming months, so make sure you stay tuned. Here's what this means for you in your everyday life as a gun owner or someone who cares about self-defense. This ruling changes the math for how you interact with the legal system, especially if you ever find yourself in a heated situation or a legal dispute. It means that the line between being a law-abiding citizen and being a prohibited person has become much thinner and harder to see. You have to be more careful than ever before about your public conduct and your legal standing in your community. Let's look at a realistic scenario involving a simple traffic stop that many of us face every few years. Imagine you are carrying your firearm legally, you have your permit, and you are following all the rules of the road. But maybe you have a messy situation at home or a legal dispute with a neighbor that led to a temporary court order you didn't think was a big deal. Under the new logic of this Supreme Court ruling, that small civil matter could turn your routine traffic stop into a major felony arrest. People often assume that as long as they aren't a bad person, the law will protect them, but the law is a set of technical gears that don't care about your heart. Another scenario could involve traveling across a state line where the laws are slightly different regarding how you store your gun. If that state has a law that they claim is based on an old historical principle, they might try to use this new Supreme Court ruling to justify taking your property. You might think you are safe because of the Second Amendment, but the state might see it very differently now. Think about a first-time gun owner who just bought a pistol for home defense and is trying to learn all the complex rules. They might see a headline saying the Supreme Court upheld a gun ban and get scared into giving up their rights or hiding their gun. This ruling creates a lot of legal gray areas that can lead to people making mistakes out of fear or simple misunderstanding. It is no longer enough to just know the main laws. You have to understand the vibe of how courts are shifting their focus. Even for people who keep a gun at home and never carry it in public, this ruling has a personal impact you can't ignore. It reinforces the idea that the government can look at your personal life and decide you are not responsible enough to own a firearm. This could affect everything from how red flag laws are enforced to how background checks are handled in the future. The court is basically saying that your rights are tied to a standard of behavior that the government gets to define and update. If you are a parent, you might worry about how these shifting definitions of safety and danger will affect your children's future rights. We are living in a time where a single mistake or a bad day in court could follow a person for the rest of their lives. That is why it is so important to stay informed and understand that the legal landscape is constantly moving under your feet. You cannot afford to rely on what you learned 5 or 10 years ago because the Supreme Court just hit the reset button. This is like a game of musical chairs where the music just changed its tempo, and you need to make sure you have a seat when it stops. Many people are still operating under the old rules of the Bruin case, thinking that history is an absolute shield against any new law. But the Rahimi ruling shows that the shield has some cracks in it, and the government knows exactly where to aim. You need to be proactive about your legal safety just as much as you are about your physical safety when you carry. Let's talk about the myths that are floating around, because I have seen some really bad takes on the internet since this ruling dropped. The first big myth is that the Second Amendment is basically dead now because the Supreme Court voted 8-1 against a gun owner. That is a huge exaggeration, and it misses the point of what the court was actually trying to do in this specific case. They didn't destroy the right to carry, but they did clarify that the right has limits when it comes to people who are a danger. The second myth is that this ruling only affects people like Zaki Rahimi, who are doing bad things and getting into trouble. This is the one that should worry you the most, because it makes you feel safe when you might actually be in a legal danger zone. The legal test created in this case can be applied to anyone, not just people with a long list of police reports or violent histories. If a state passes a law saying certain groups of people are not law-abiding, this ruling could be used to support that law in court. The third myth is that the historical test is gone, and we are going back to the old way of doing things where the government always wins. Chief Justice Roberts was very clear that the historical test is still the law of the land. It just isn't as strict as some people hoped. It is more like a family tree, where a new law just needs to show it is related to an old law rather than being an exact clone. This is still a much better standard for gun owners than what we had 10 years ago, even if it feels like a step back. I want to correct these myths because fear and bad information are the biggest enemies of a free people who want to keep their rights. When you hear someone saying that all is lost or that this ruling doesn't matter at all, you should be very skeptical of their advice. The truth is always somewhere in the middle, and in this case, the truth is that the legal fight has just moved to a new and more complicated phase. We have to be smarter and more focused on the details of how these laws are actually written and applied. The bigger issue is how this ruling will be used as a weapon by politicians who want to pass more restrictive gun laws in your state. They will point to this 8-1 victory and claim that the Supreme Court has given them a green light to go after carry rights. They will use the phrase credible threat to justify all kinds of new bans and requirements that have nothing to do with actual safety. This is the trap that Justice Thomas was trying to warn us about in his lone dissent against the rest of the court. Here is what most people still don't see about the road ahead and how this will play out in the lower courts over the next few years. Every time a new gun law is challenged, the lawyers for the state are going to cite the Rahimi case as their main argument for why the law should stay. They will try to stretch the idea of a historical principle as far as it can possibly go until it covers almost anything they want. This means the next few years will be full of messy court battles that will decide the future of your rights. This is where the next fight starts, and it is going to happen in small courtrooms all across the country before it ever makes it back to the Supreme Court. We are going to see fights over who counts as a responsible citizen and what kind of proof the government needs to take away a gun. We will see cases about whether a nonviolent misdemeanor can be used to strip someone of their Second Amendment rights forever. The Rahimi ruling didn't end the debate. It just gave the government a new set of tools to use in that debate. Think of it like a new set of rules for a sport that everyone has been playing for a long time, and now everyone has to figure out the new strategy. The government is already practicing their new moves, and they are hoping that you aren't paying attention to the changes. They want you to think that everything is the same as it was yesterday, so that you are caught off guard when the new laws hit. But you are here because you want to be prepared and you want to know the truth before it affects your life. The part that should worry you is how fast a local judge can now use this ruling to make a decision that changes your life. If you are ever in a situation where someone asks for a restraining order against you, even if it is based on a lie, your gun rights are now in immediate danger. Under the old rules, you might have had more protection, but now the path for the government to disarm you is much clearer and faster. This is why being a responsible gun owner now includes being a very careful and legally aware citizen at all times. We have to look at the future of the Supreme Court itself, and how this 8-1 vote might change the way they handle the next big gun case. Some people think this vote shows that the conservative majority is starting to get nervous about the big changes they made in the Bruen case. They might be looking for ways to slow down or to show that they are not just rubber stamping every gun rights claim that comes their way. This shift in the court's mood could be very important for cases involving magazine bans or semi-auto bans. If the court is moving toward a more middle ground approach, it means that we can't just expect them to strike down every bad law that comes along. It means the fight in the state legislatures and in the lower courts is more important than it has ever been in our lifetimes. We have to be active in protecting our rights at every level of government, not just waiting for a big win in Washington, D.C. This ruling is a wake-up call for anyone who thought the battle for the Second Amendment was over after the Bruen win. I know this can feel overwhelming because the law is complicated and the stakes are so high for you and your family's safety, but you don't have to navigate this alone or spend hours reading through dry legal documents that are written to be confusing. Our goal is to break these big moments down into clear steps that you can use to stay safe and keep your rights intact. If you value this kind of deep dive into the legal news that actually matters, make sure you are subscribed so you never miss an update. When we connect everything back together, we see a picture of a legal system that is trying to find its balance after a series of massive changes. The headline says the Supreme Court ruled 8-1 against a person who had a gun, but the real story is about the new test they created. That test will be used to judge you, your neighbors, and every other gun owner in America for a long time to come. It is a tool that can be used for safety, but it can also be used for overreach if we aren't careful. The myths we talked about show that most people are only seeing the surface of this ruling and not the deep currents underneath. They are either too scared or too confident, and both of those things can lead to very bad decisions in the real world. You now know that the historical test is still alive, but it is more flexible than we thought, which means the government has more room to move. You also know that your status as a law-abiding citizen is something the government is looking at more closely than ever. The scenarios we went through, like the traffic stop or the cross-state travel, show how these abstract legal ideas can turn into real problems in a heartbeat. It isn't about being paranoid. It's about being prepared and knowing where the legal landmines are buried so you can step around them. A single mistake in a courtroom or a misunderstanding of a new law can have consequences that last a lifetime and can't be easily fixed. That is the emotional reality of being a gun owner in a time of major legal shifts like the one we are seeing now. Everything comes back to the core idea of your freedom and your ability to protect the people you love without being treated like a criminal. This ruling is a reminder that our rights are precious and that they require constant attention and defense from all of us. We cannot just look at a vote count and think we know the whole story without digging into the details that the media usually ignores. The details are where the real power lives, and the details are what will keep you safe in the long run. As we move forward into this new era of gun laws, I want you to remember 3 most important takeaways from this entire situation. First, the Supreme Court has confirmed that they can take guns away from people they consider a credible threat, even without a criminal conviction. This means your personal conduct and any civil legal issues you have are now directly tied to your Second Amendment rights in a very big way. You must be more careful than ever about your legal standing and how you are perceived by the court system. Second, the historical test for gun laws is becoming more about general principles and less about finding an exact match from the year 1791. This gives the government more room to pass new laws, but it also gives us a clear area where we have to fight back in the lower courts. We have to make sure that these principles are not stretched so far that they become meaningless and let the government do whatever it wants. The battle is now about defining what those historical limits actually were and how they apply today. Third, this ruling is not the end of the Second Amendment, but it is a major pivot point that changes the strategy for everyone involved in gun rights. We are seeing a more cautious Supreme Court that wants to show it can still allow for public safety measures while protecting the core of our rights. This means we have to be more sophisticated in how we defend our rights and how we talk about them to our friends and neighbors. We have to show that being a responsible gun owner is the norm, not the exception, in our society. This matters long-term because it sets the stage for the next decade of legal battles over everything from carry permits to the types of firearms we can own. Your children and grandchildren will live in the legal world that is being built right now by these 8-to-1 decisions and the cases that follow them. This is about more than just one court case. It is about the fundamental relationship between the citizen and the state in America. It is about whether our rights are seen as solid ground or as something that can be moved by the government. You are the kind of person who refuses to stay uninformed while the world changes around you, and that is why you are part of this community. We are committed to giving you the real legal updates without the noise, the drama, or the political bias that you find everywhere else. Our mission is to make sure you have the knowledge you need to stay free, stay safe, and stay on the right side of the law. If you haven't already, subscribe now to join a group of serious people who take their rights and their responsibilities seriously. I want to know what you are going to do differently now that you understand the true impact of the Rahimi ruling. Are you going to be more careful about your legal records, or are you going to get more involved in local gun rights groups to fight these changes? This is a conversation that we need to have as a community so we can support each other and share the best ways to stay protected. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on the court's 8-to-1 decision, and let's keep the discussion going about our future.